Welcome to a new episode of Becoming a Post-Growth Planner, Obstacles and Challenges to Changing Roles and Practices. My name is Christian Lamker. I'm Assistant Professor for Sustainable Transformation and Regional Planning at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And my guest today is Antje Bruns from the University of Trier.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm Antje Bruns. I'm a professor in geography for governance and sustainable development. And there I'm head of a really great team, and we call ourselves the Governance and Sustainability Lab.
Governance and sustainability, this also takes us to how you entered the debates about post-growth and planning from the directions of sustainability, but also the global south and questions of the interface between science and society. We will get back to that later. But to have a start, how would you position post-growth in relation to the history of especially global sustainability debates?
Well, yes, that's really a great, but also a huge question. And I would try to answer it in that way. So my studies, particularly in Ghana, in West Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, really led me to the core finding that, we really live in a complex world where our decisions, even those about sustainability transformations, have huge impacts on lives and livelihoods in other regions. And so it is when we look back in history. So our wealth and our modes of consumption, Ulrich Brandt and Marcus Wisson would call it the imperial mode of living, really caused the unsustainability and injustice in the global south. And if we really want to talk about global sustainability, then we should also focus on these injustices and unsustainabilities. And that, in a nutshell, really, sort of underpins and informs my understanding of the relation. And that, again, is then also part of post-growth thinking, I would say, that we should also look at the global interconnections and complexities.
We have also met at the Dortmund conference in February 2023, where you gave a keynote on governance of sustainability. And in that, you also mentioned that sustainability is fundamentally about justice. I understand this can have even global dimensions, the global south. Could you briefly explain to our listeners at which point or how you recognize that sustainability is fundamentally about justice, especially when maybe making the step towards post-growth?
Yeah, well, so even if we look back at the history of the sustainability concept, that was informed by the Brundtland Commission and the later discussion about that, it was always fundamentally about justice. It was always about how to supply goods and services to people. There it was rather framed in this global north-south perspective, so that it was a focus on poverty, for example. But that have been the origin of the sustainability debate. And even if we look at, for example, the German or the European context of sustainability, we realize that we can achieve sustainability and sustainable development only if we look at justice. And we could look at almost every scale. We could look at the local scale, the city scale, for example, and we see huge injustices manifested in their lives in cities. So, for example, who has access to green spaces in a close distance, just to ask one example. So that would be like an entry point for me to always ask who benefits from certain goods and services and who carries the burdens and the harms. And who has control over decision-making, who has control over resources. And this framing is really fundamental for my thinking about sustainable development.
Does this mean in sustainable development that we should also focus much more both on sufficiency, on what we need to live, and on the other side also on maybe maximum limits, or also clear cuts on what we take out of a limited stock of resources?
Absolutely. So I would fully agree to that. So sufficiency plays a key role in that, to really ask the question, so what is enough to have a good life? And of course, we need to define good life. And I would say, well, shelter is part of that. And, well, enough food and water and, of course, energy. But certainly a good life does not mean that you have the right to, for example, emit a lot of CO2 emissions that then ultimately cause climate change, or that you have a dietary style, like a food consumption style that exploits resources in other worlds and regions of that. So sufficiency is like a key paradigm, I would say. But also the other strategies that we know, like efficiency and coherency and thinking in circular terms, for example, circular economies, is also part of that. So I would also strongly argue for different strategies that in combination really can inform us how a good life looks like and how many resources we consume and, are able to consume, but also are allowed to consume in a context of really, like it's really about taking responsibility in the end, I would say. So having and living a responsible life.
Yeah, and this we talk about inherently positive things, the good life, what we need to live. So this sounds a good way to go. But what would you say? How can this idea be more convincing to be more taken up at a broader scale? As in principle, there are some quite positive ingredients in all these thoughts.
It's really about how to make this real utopias happen, but also how to perhaps even communicate that properly and discuss it with various like actor groups, but also like different people that perhaps never thought about these things, because that is perhaps also like one observation that I do, that of course in our intellectual academic bubble of post-growth thinkers and sustainability scholars, we find these ideas quite convincing. But if you are like a part of a socioeconomic strata that really struggles with the everyday life, then it's perhaps, it sounds really academic, it sounds really intellectual, it sounds really far away from, yes, your very everyday struggles. And I think that is exactly like the challenge we have to go, how to do that. Perhaps we really need to go other ways, like with, for example, visualizations, with art projects, but also with really co-producing knowledge, for example, with people that like work in the health sector, just to name one sector that is sometimes very far away from these discussions. So yeah, I think I do not have like the one and only answer to your question, but I think it's really about, leaving our siloed system of the intellectual academic bubble.
Would you say we might need other different terms, or maybe even fewer terms and more things that are closely aligned to daily life worlds of people?
Absolutely. I think if we talk about the transformation to sustainability, and I would frame post-growth as one strategy towards the transformation to sustainability, then I would say it's fundamentally about changing and altering the everyday of all of us, like all of us that live in Europe, for example, just to have a regional focus now. So, and if we do that, if we ask that to fundamentally change the everyday, then we also need to go to where people fulfill everyday practices, be it that they are mobile and they have a distance to take, for example, from their home to their office or their workplace, or what they consume, what they buy in terms of food and so on. So we really need to go there and engage with people. But then it will be at one point also about the costs and the prices and what it takes, right, from people. Definitely.
Yeah, so in my experience, post-growth or growth-oriented problems are quite visible for many people, though maybe not using this concept, but especially in terms of limited resources, of increased prices that often relate to a certain way of positioning economic agendas and also perceiving solutions to problems. Where would you say does post-growth really help us to shed maybe new lights on problems that we perceive in our daily lives, and on the solutions, the positive solutions, the ways forward that we can imagine? Let's stay maybe in the European context for that.
I think I see it on different levels. Like if we, for example, look at how people conceive their workplace, then there is an increasing number of studies that say that many people are not happy with their workplace. What they do, how much they get for it, and how much they get for it is not only the money they get for it, but also perhaps like the reputation and like acknowledging what people do and are able to do and the good ideas they have. That is just one part. If we look at the workplace and what people do for a living, but if we look at people that are not employed, that are unemployed, or the elderly people, or even very young students that have been excluded from school during Corona times, we also see that people are increasingly lonely. So, and get into depression. So I think everything if we look at the individual, we see that people suffer in terms of mental health, and perhaps they also suffer in terms of not being part of a community. And that would be here my argument. Post-growth planning and a differently organized economic system, an economic system that is part of the social, could also bring people back, like individuals back to a community where they feel recognized and where they are together with others doing useful things. And I think that is a co-benefit, but perhaps also the real utopia a post-growth world could look like. An utopia that is really driven by alternative economies and alternative social relations.
Positioning humans more central, the social parts of sustainability, that is really the core of how I would also frame post-growth planning. But what would you say are the major obstacles why we face such a hardship to move to changing something, whereas these problems are well acknowledged? If I open any website or newspaper, news websites, it is all over. But what is the major challenge, or where do you see the obstacles? Why is it so hard to move a step forward from these problems to say we at least do one step and then maybe following ones?
That's again a tricky question, I would say. But the perhaps sad thing is that if I open my newspaper, I read different things. I read rather the depressing things that, for example, right-wing parties are gaining momentum. And usually these parties are rather against any transformation towards sustainability. Just to mention one political very important movement throughout Europe, but throughout the globe, I would even say, even internationally, it's what we face. So I see like political movements that are rather opting and arguing against any knowledge that is rooted in sustainability and climate discourses. And I also see like these power nexus between the economy and the political system that is rather than on a macro structure, and that is so powerful in the way it is a major hindrance to any, like perhaps even incremental change on the local level, that I sometimes also don't know where really the leverage points are. I mean, how can we upscale all the nice pioneer activities and niches that we see, and where is the leverage? And perhaps really the leverage is with the planning system, right? To really plan other worlds, to plan other cities where we have different goals and objectives that we really follow, and to learn from these good examples, and to create different alliances between the economy, civil society, and the political actors and planners.
Yeah, so you see quite a role for planning in that, and also for planning to bring things together. Did we maybe over the past 10, 15 years focus too much on the individual, on what individuals can contribute, and maybe forgot a bit how to bring this all together to then really develop change that is not only a small niche or pocket somewhere, but that extends to a region, a nation, maybe even whole Europe?
Yes, I would think so. And perhaps that is even, or has been even, like a very powerful strategy by powerful economic interests to rather always say that like it's about individual consumption, right? So the individual with the very own consumption mode and consumption pattern is able to make a difference. But this individualism strategy is also like a huge, well, how could one frame it? It's leading us back or far away from the structures that need to be changed. And that is, again, the structure of the economic system, and it's the structure of how the economy is organized, for example, by underlying infrastructure. And here, then again, the state comes into play, because the state has the opportunity, and the planners, they have the opportunity to plan infrastructures differently. But I think, yes, that is what happened the last 10, 15 years in a very neoliberal realm, let's put it that way, to only focus on the individual and how the individual can change the unsustainability of the current system.
Planners are somehow a bit of both. You're both part of the structure, part of the state, the city, but also these are individuals planning within these structures, which also can in itself cause quite some tension. How could we maybe support then planners in this struggle between the different growth-based problems, between visions, utopias that are there, and then maybe to have at least more of these debates?
First of all, I would argue that we really need a more reflexive knowledge also in planning curricular and in like how to teach future planners, to really let them also think about the relation of knowledge and system knowledge and transformational knowledge, and that these are different knowledges. One is like for example, even evidence based or underpinned knowledge about different sectors, systems, like the natural and the societal system, for example. But that this is different from knowing what to do and where like we want to go, which is rather an ethical question. And the ethical question comes later and is driven by normative ideas. And I think I would always like, if I am teaching, I try to usually discuss that with students. So what is really the fact-based knowledge here, and what comes into that because we have specific belief systems, mental models, perhaps even a knowledge which is underpinned by our very own biography, that I'm grown up, for example, in a very rural area where, of course, I needed a car and to have a driving license, whereas other students who grew up in larger cities perhaps have different mental models in their minds. And I'll try to reflect on that. And I think more reflexivity and a more nuanced knowing of the diversity of the world is always useful for planners.
Does this then mean that planning should really be much more about ethics, moral decisions, values, about also the conflicts that we might not be able to solve by, let's say, any rational scientific methods, but that we will need to solve by taking decisions and working with the advantages, disadvantages, the winners and losers?
Yes, absolutely. So planning for me is about to engage with ambivalences, with controversies, with with contested ideas, with everything that is around that, even with counter planning, right? So and I have the impression that within the last years or even decade, 1 or 2 decades, we really entered the post-political era also in the planning discourse, that we are seeking for the consensus. We are seeking for decisions and pathways where everyone is on board. And of course, that is like in an ideal world, that would be great, but we are dealing with different interests. And sometimes these interests are very powerful in terms of institutional interests and economic interests. So I think it's always good to be aware that in the end, there are these controversies, and it's about, dealing with that exactly.
Yeah, if I look a bit at both of us, then we are maybe also a bit part of both the problem and the possible solution. Because as researchers and educators, we can take different positions to spatial planning practice. And I would say we're also a bit maybe torn between the consensus seeking, which would be a wonderful way to solve issues, and then maybe a reality that doesn't exactly fit to that model and that doesn't develop in the way that we would hope for. So would you recognize flaws in contemporary approaches, and how could we also position science research more effectively in that regard, as there's certainly not a lack of researchers, of scientists, of scientific knowledge available, but a clear lack of transforming, of changing, of actually moving to the doing, let's say.
Yes, and I think that is also perhaps part of how the academic system and the universities developed within also that wider socioeconomic context in the last years, right? So if we look at reputation systems within universities, these are at times very far away from what the solving of societal and socioecological problems would need in terms of knowledge creation, but also in terms of knowledge co-production. So, of course, we need also here different criteria for what good and relevant and original research is. And some of us, like those with tenured positions, they have perhaps a bit more agency in that, and perhaps even more freedom to do that kind of transformative research, whereas others, they certainly do not have they do not have the freedom to do so, right? Because they are themselves struggling within an unjust system, if you like. So, but yes, we have responsibility, and I think, at least for me, that is what I aim to do, right? Like being based at Trier University, where I think I could say that I created a new institute in geography, right? Because of course, with my colleagues from physical geography, we had the opportunity to select I think now 4 new professors, and we created a new geography department that is centered around a critical, heterodox, diverse take on space and society and economy in order to change the world and to make transformation happen. So yes, we have the responsibility and we have a differentiated agency.
Sounds like a great approach. Let me just briefly follow up on that. There is often the challenge when you think of co-producing knowledge, working together on societal challenges, to become also a bit one-sided maybe on these ideas that are immediately valued from another side, from a politics and practice side, where some of the also needed discussions might be quite critical and quite conflictual at first sight. So do you see good ideas how to keep these debates still possible when working together with other actors and also ensuring to maybe keep even alternatives part of research and of research debates?
Yeah, well, I think that again goes back to being open and reflexive on the very own theories and assumptions, but also on the very own blind spots. And I think that your question really relates perhaps to what I would call boundary work, like really creating good conditions for boundary work, like boundaries between different disciplines or between different theories or approaches, and how to navigate that. And yeah, I think here ingredients are like respect and openness and like really seeking for perhaps even diverse explanations and diverse takes on the same research question. Well, yes, and that is important to keep that in mind. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, in this podcast, we have collected a number of diverse statements towards the very end about what post-growth planning could be or what it is from the individual perspectives. So then before we finish this episode, I would like you to finish the sentence for me. Post-growth planning is
to change the understanding of the world.
That's a nice final statement. So I would say, let's continue changing this together. With all listeners today, feel invited to join this further search for developing what post-growth planning is. And from my side, many thanks to Antje for joining me today and for sharing your insights from Trier University and also globally.
Thank you very much. It was really a pleasure to be here.